Hey everyone, welcome back to Product Summit. I'm here with Karin, who's going to deliver our final talk of the entire event. Karin has 15 years of founding, operating, and scaling startups. So her talk on evaluating big ideas comes from a place of deep experience. So I'm really excited to see what she's going to be sharing with us today. So without further ado, let me hand our stream over to Karin. Karin, welcome.
Thank you, Devin, and hey everybody, really great to be here. It's been a really awesome 3 days, and I'm excited to wrap things up with my talk on evaluating big ideas. So what I'm going to give you is a framework that you can apply to any strategic decision that you might be making in your business. For the purpose of today, I'm going to focus heavily on product since that's the theme of the event. So a little bit about me. As Devin said, I've been involved in startups for a really long time. I started out operating and scaling other people's companies, and I've also, as a product founder, started and scaled a couple of companies myself. Right now, I'm in the process of figuring out what to build next and doing a little bit of advisory stuff on the side as well. So one of the things I've always found hardest about building is getting the conviction around new initiatives and ideas. And that's because we're usually, as founders and senior leaders, operating in an environment of extreme uncertainty where there's a huge amount of noise and there never seems to be enough data to point us in any one clear direction. And for founders in particular, that can create a huge amount of anxiety and procrastination slows you down and leads to a lot of bad decision making. So hopefully what I'm going to be able to show you today is not something that will make your decisions for you, sorry about that, but I'm hoping to help you to identify and manage risks, optimize and allocate your very scarce resources, and make decision-making a little bit more transparent so that you can secure the buy-in from your teams and potentially from your investors as well. So how do you square the need to move quickly with the need for diligence? You just heard Valerio's talk on lean decision-making, and for the thousands of decisions you're probably making in your startups every week, 70% to 80% of those will be in that bucket. And you need to give your teams the autonomy so they can just go ahead and get shit done. But there are some trade-offs associated with that. The more we optimize for speed, the more tolerance we have to bake in case we're wrong. So this framework is really for evaluating the high-level strategic decisions that could literally kill your company if you get them wrong. So one of the things that I've observed is that the companies that I admire the most have baked in a really rigid culture around how they make decisions from the get-go. The most famous of those is probably Facebook. I'm sure you've all heard the mantra, move fast and break things, something I think they've moved away from for reasons that you'll be familiar with as they've scaled. But initially, it will have made complete sense for them. They had a product that stuck. People wanted to use it and they wanted to scale as quickly as possible before other competitors popped up. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got a company like Stripe, who've always been very thoughtful and rigorous about how they approach their product and strategic decisions. And that's probably in part influenced by the fact that they're in a regulated space. So obviously the cost of a bad decision can have really grave impact. And also they provide critical infrastructure to their clients. So if their payments API goes down, that can cost their customers a huge amount of money. So in that context, it makes a lot of sense for them to be slow and thoughtful about how they build stuff. So there isn't really a right or wrong answer to how you should approach this. But I guess the important point to take away here is that you should kind of know where your company sits on that on that spectrum and align your teams and your processes around that accordingly. So one of the things that can be a little bit counterintuitive at first is that going slow can actually make you go a lot faster. So, and that's because knowing that you've done your homework can give you and everybody else the confidence that you can then proceed at speed. And Stripe, as I just mentioned, are the perfect example of a company who've built a very productive execution machine around a culture of rigorous thinking. So what are big ideas? And how do we know when we see them? So usually a big idea is any major strategic decision that would heavily impact on the direction or trajectory of your company. It could also be an initiative that requires a serious allocation of resources, and it would also usually be a decision that's kind of hard to reverse. So a really quick way to surface a big idea when you see one is to just ask yourself the question, what happens if we're wrong? And Jeff Bezos has got a really good way of describing this in their internal culture documents. They think about one- and two-way door decision-making processes, where a two-way door decision can be tested, implemented, and rolled back with limited effort, whereas a one-way door can't be easily reversed. So understanding the difference is really important so you guys can focus your time on what's crucial without sweating the small stuff. Now, in theory, you can obviously unpick any decision, right? The reality, though, is that in an early stage startup in particular, where we have very scarce resources, the question usually becomes, if we're wrong, can we correct our course before we run out of runway? And by correcting our course, I don't just mean building the next best alternative idea or initiative that we have on our roadmap, but it's really about figuring out what milestones and metrics do I need to hit to raise from the investors I want on the terms that I want to raise. And you need to bake that into your decision-making process. So let's look at identifying big ideas in practice. So at a feature level, you've probably already got frameworks like RICE, or there are probably dozens of others by now that you can use to make decisions really quickly. And usually that's because features, if you're doing it right, you're implementing a fairly lightweight version of that in the first place, and you can roll that back with fairly limited risk. And the same goes for epics in most cases, but again, depending on the complexity, there may be a need for more diligence. When you get to launching new products or entirely new use cases for an existing product, though, those are usually a lot more resource intensive, and that's because they can touch several teams from your growth team to engineering, product design. There are usually lots of different teams involved in that. You might also have things like external partnership dependencies, which take a long time to source, negotiate, launch, and initiate. So an example of where this kind of thing has gone wrong fairly recently is when Monzo tried to launch their initial premium account proposition. And they found very quickly that it just didn't resonate with customers. People weren't buying it. So after just 5 or 6 months, they had to pull the product. Now, obviously, that was absolutely the right decision, but what it did mean is that they then had to spend another 10 months rebuilding and relaunching it at probably quite a significant expense. Now, a company like Monzo with really deep pockets can probably stomach the impact of that without, it being business critical or mission critical to them. But for a smaller startup with even more limited resources, that could really be a killer event. So it really makes sense to think long and hard about anything that involves new products and use cases. The same goes for customer segments. So you usually spend a huge amount of cash acquiring your customers in the first place. And if you're not spending cash and you're really doing it well, then you're spending a lot of effort on managing a community and building on that. So if you do have to pivot your target audience, or if you're launching a product to an entirely new audience, that often means you have to relearn everything about that acquisition process, and that you have to really optimize your CAC again as well. And that can take a lot of time. So that's something you want to think about very thoughtfully too. And finally, and by far the sort of hardest thing to reverse generally, is launching into entirely new markets. And by that, I mean either new markets by geography, or it could also be new market segments where you need to conduct a lot of research. There's a lot of upfront investment in potentially hiring, in producing marketing and PR collateral, potentially localizing your product, and then spending money on reaching new customers. So a couple of examples that spring to mind here are N26 and Robinhood, who both pulled out of the UK very shortly after launching here. Again, they had the sort of war chest to be able to stomach that, but for an earlier stage company, that would have been detrimental. So how does this framework actually work? I'm not actually going to run you through the Google Sheet today because that's a bit boring, and I've done a README that accompanies it that you can go through in your own time, and you'll obviously be able to ping me as well if you've got any questions. But essentially, it's very straightforward. So you have you score all of your ideas along 4 categories, and that's the market opportunity, the quality of the customer problem, the initial solution that you have in mind, and any unfair advantage that you think you might have compared to other companies who might be trying to build something similar. You can then add your own weightings and multipliers because, as Valerio said, not all criteria are made equal. So you can either apply that here at a category level, or you can do it at a property level for each of the properties we're going to discuss in a second. And then the model essentially just ranks all of your ideas based on your inputs. Now, the way that this shouldn't be used is that you shouldn't just assume that whatever the top is necessarily the one that you should run with. But what you'll find is that you get a very general direction very quickly, and you can then choose to go deeper where you have the most doubts about the assumptions that you've made, and kind of build on that from there. So what are the characteristics of really great ideas? Let's start by looking at the market opportunity. So obviously you want to be building something and driving new initiatives in markets that are substantial. Even average companies in a really big market have a higher likelihood of success, and there are plenty of examples of mediocre companies who still make lots of money. Obviously, you shouldn't be aiming to be that one, but it definitely helps to be in a market that's sizable enough to have that addressable audience. What's even more exciting, though, and is highlighted here in green because it's something that I've ranked highly in the model example that I'm going to share with you, is that even better than absolute market size is a market segment that's growing really fast and ideally emerging right now. So if there's a new need that's come up that didn't exist before, insurance for e-scooters, for example, might be a great example here, then that's way more exciting than building in an existing market where you've already got a lot of competition and alternative solutions. And the other thing you want to think about is how bad is our competition here. So examples of bad competition are where a market is very fragmented, or there's potentially a lot of offline or high friction user experience involved in solving that problem currently. So any of those would typically present an awesome opportunity. So next, let's look at the quality of the problem. So there are millions. So first of all, you want to have a popular problem, right? So something that millions of people or companies ideally have. Secondly, ideally, you want it to be something mandatory. Now, that could be because it's a compulsory purchase that they simply can't live without. Food is the most obvious one that would be a compulsory purchase for the vast majority of people. But there are also things like regulatory changes that might exist or be coming into force soon that would make something mandatory that wasn't mandatory before. So if you've identified a problem that falls into that scope, then that definitely presents a really exciting opportunity. You also want the problem to be urgent. So you want something that people are trying to solve today. And if your customers are asking you to build this now and they're literally trying to pull this out of your hands, then that's a great indicator of an urgent problem, and you should definitely apply a multiplier to that in your model as well. And finally, although this doesn't apply to everybody, you want it to be very frequent. So an example of where this doesn't apply, because it definitely applies more often than not, is a company like Kazoo, where People don't buy a car every week or every month or probably even every year, but when they do, it's a big ticket sale. So I'm sure Kazoo make a substantial amount on each transaction, which makes their model work. So you mostly want to try and target any initiatives that solve high engagement problems, because that's usually something that's going to make your product a lot more sticky and help you drive your LTV. So when it comes to the solution, ultimately what we're trying to do is build a 10x better product. And 10x is kind of arbitrary. You just want the product to be by as many multiples better as the next best alternative as possible. So you need to evaluate every new initiative and idea in the context of, will building this thing get us any closer to having a 10x better product than the next best alternative? You also want to think about competitive moats. So does this create an entirely new moat, or does it potentially strengthen an existing one? So there are lots of examples of moats, and we could probably do a separate talk on that. But the most interesting ones for me have always been lock-in. So can we build something that makes it harder for our customers to leave us? Can we introduce anything that creates network effects? And can we create any data moats that will allow us to build exponentially better products in the future? You also want to look at product-led growth. So everybody knows that customer acquisition is really expensive, particularly if you're going predominantly via paid channels. So if you can have any kind of initiative that helps your product to grow itself, that helps your product to become more viral, then you should definitely score that with a multiplier in your model. And finally, you should be asking yourselves, realistically, how feasible is it for us to build this at our current stage? So you might have a great idea that you can build later down the line, following your next raise, for example, but you might just not have the engineering resources and the budget to build that thing right now. So you need to figure out if it's feasible. And finally, you need to think about any unfair advantage that you might have. Now, this one's a bit of a gotcha, because I think oftentimes we trick ourselves into thinking we have an unfair advantage when we actually don't. So you have to really challenge yourselves and as a team to make sure that you're being entirely honest and critical with yourselves about these. So the first one is, do you have some kind of unique insight? So have you uncovered something on your journey so far that nobody else knows? That means you can build this thing better than anybody else. Do you have any technology advantage? So is there something in your IP, in your technical secret sauce that you've developed so far that means you can build a substantially better solution for this particular initiative? Does it give you a distribution advantage? So can you unlock any channel advantages, maybe through existing partnerships or relationships that you have that would help you scale this particular initiative faster? And then finally, and this is probably the weakest one of all, do you have any network advantages? And that could be things like unfair access to capital, or it could also be access to flagship case study customers that you might be able to get an intro into to help you grow and excel in that particular initiative faster. So how do you get started? So it's actually really simple, and there isn't a huge amount of work involved for you to start on this tomorrow. So what you need to do is, first of all, aggregate all of your ideas. And those might come from roadmaps, they might come from your decks, your strategy documents, or maybe they're still in your head. So just try and get your teams together and figure out what are the really big things that we want to think about doing in the next 18 months, say, and then start to populate the template with those. The next thing you need to do is run through them and formulate your initial hypotheses. And this is something that's largely based on gut instinct. So it shouldn't take more than 2 to 3 minutes for every new initiative that you have, because you'll go and test those in a more robust fashion later on. And finally, you then need to go away and figure out how to test them. And testing them could mean just digging into your own data. It could mean conducting some user research, or it might mean doing a bunch of research into new markets, speaking to people, whatever. There's a bunch of different ways you can test stuff. And you want to adjust how much time you spend on testing based on the risk involved of being wrong. So you just kind of need to weigh that up and decide what time you want to spend on it. I strongly recommend that you always time box those exercises so you don't end up going down a rabbit hole and overthinking things. So a couple of final thoughts. If there's one thing I'd love you to take away, it's that you really need to think about baking decision-making into your culture. If you haven't done it already, that's something you should be thinking about when you come away from this. The other thing to remember is to avoid one-size-fits-all decision-making. So it's perfectly fine to have different processes for different types of decisions so that you can make sure you're moving fast, but at the same time planning for the future and protecting yourselves against downside. It's also super important to be transparent and involve your teams in this. One reason is that it takes a lot of the burden of collating the data off your shoulders, but it also just helps for people to understand why decisions are made and why the direction might be changing. And actually, when I read Glassdoor reviews, this seems to be one of the most common complaints that people working in early stage startups have, that they kind of think the leadership and founders are whimsical and change direction at will. And I suspect that that's not actually true. I think it's more often than not just a case that the process hasn't been clearly communicated. And last but not least, you should try to avoid hedging your bets across multiple ideas at the same time. So you can do that later and have a portfolio approach to initiatives that you work on once you've got the resources and the teams in place to do that. But initially, in the very early stages, while it might seem prudent to do that, it actually usually means that you're compromising all over the place and not testing any one thing really well, and therefore you can't really trust the results. So you should always try to double down on the thing that you think is going to move the needle for you next, and then dump it as quickly as you can if you think that it's not going to get you to where you need to be. Cool. So that concludes my talk. Thanks for sticking around, and obviously more than happy to answer any questions you have now, or I think there might be a session afterwards, so I'll definitely be around for that as well. The guys are going to share the template with you, and my email address is on the deck, so if you've got any questions once you actually get cracking with it, I'm more than happy to answer those.
Karin, thank you so much for that presentation. I'm going to kick off the questions with one sort of from me, which is around discipline. So obviously you've laid out a very clear framework on how we can be rigorous with our decision-making process. But I mean, I'm guilty of sort of knowing these tools exist and then still just sort of going for it. So do you have any thoughts or philosophy around like the flexibility of when you apply these frameworks versus like you do need to be stringent or else you're not going to get the results versus like sometimes you got to go with your gut and vice versa?
Yeah, great question. And by the way, I've been guilty of that as well. So I think the first thing is that obviously you need ownership, right? So for all of this really big stuff, in a pre and even post-Series A, early post-Series A company, I think the founders have to own this. So it should be something that the CEO owns from a vision perspective, because all of these high-level initiatives should be working backwards from the vision and from the goals that need to be achieved to get to the next company milestone. And I think beyond that, it's a case of regularly touching base with, depending on what the team makeup is, but obviously the product leadership team needs to be involved. And I would advocate for updating this on like a monthly basis at least, and just rigorously holding yourself to that. And I think by involving other people, you kind of make yourself accountable, because it's quite it's pretty shit leadership to start something you don't finish, and then people are like expecting for you to update them on where you're at with this stuff. So I try to bake this into the sort of regular monthly updates I have with the whole team. And then we can kind of flag any priorities that have changed and actually explain why that might be, or what we've learned that has sort of caused us to do that.
And I guess sort of on that rigorous point, like could you share with us any like specific instances in your own like career where using this has actually resulted in a very unexpected result from the decision that was created? And it's okay if
there are probably a lot. So I mentioned that right now I'm in the process of evaluating new startup ideas, actually, right? Like I'm trying to figure out what to spend my time on next. And I've used a slightly adapted version of this to literally do that. And actually the last thing that I was working on briefly and testing was a personalized nutrition product for kids. And what I realized by going through this framework is that I actually didn't have the motivation to work on that particular idea, even though we had
motivation,
customers, we had revenue, we had recurring revenue, people loved what we were doing. But it just wasn't something that I wanted to work on. So that's another dimension that you can add to the model. Separately at Lenny, I use this to figure out what products we should launch. And that was actually heavily based on underwriting decisions under the hood. So there were a bunch of people that we couldn't insure just based on their risk profiles. And we had a limited number of strikes with our insurance carrier for getting them to essentially prioritize what changes they might consider making to that underwriting model. So we use this framework very much for that, to kind of figure out where the biggest opportunities are, where are our competitors the weakest, where are the sort of gaps where we can get a wedge into that market. So you can really use it for all sorts of different decisions.
Motivation is such a great point to bring up, because there has to be alignment, especially in the founder level and the team level, around like, it's worth spending our time on this. One of the best business decisions that we ever made in my previous company was to kill the business. And it came from...
I felt like that recently. Process. It's a good feeling. You can have a beer and go, thank fuck I didn't pull through with that one.
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely that's true. And that's one of the reasons why this helps, right? Because at least you can be safe in the knowledge that if you decide not to proceed with something, that you've followed it through in a structured process.
Exactly.
And you can go back and you can remind yourself when you have those fleeting moments of doubt, why you made that decision at that time. And even just knowing that can really help to build confidence and conviction around whatever you're going to do next.
Yeah, totally. I mean, we were faced with like what would on paper be like not a great exit, but then we sort of did the decision and we realized that no one wanted to continue. So it was actually a great decision. Like it was
exactly because it's the opportunity cost, right? Like I always think of this stuff as what's the opportunity cost of me actually not working on something else that I really care about, that I want to work on for the next 10, 20 years. And that's actually quite high, right? Like time is the scarcest resource we have. So yeah, like figuring out where you spend that time, particularly when you're still relatively young and in your prime, you want to be doing the stuff that really matters and that makes you happy day to day, because there's enough shit to put up with along the way.
Yeah, preach, 100%. Fantastic. Well, I don't think we have any other questions in the queue. Do you have any parting thoughts? This is the ultimate thought of the conference. No pressure. Do you have any other things you want to leave the audience with? Yeah,
literally just don't leave decision making to chance, right? Like this is honestly something I've done in the past, and I think it's because I've always trusted my gut a lot. So you kind of end up building muscle memory that you can just make decisions on the fly and trust your gut with everything. And I think that that's okay to some degree. But the problem is you don't bring people with you, and it's very difficult often to explain to people why you think what you think. So bring your teams into your head and into your own framework that you use to evaluate stuff. And I think you'll find that people are a lot happier and actually can move a lot faster. And you can give them a lot more autonomy and responsibility as well, because you know exactly what direction everyone's pulling in.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, Karin, thank you so much for sharing this with us.
Yes,
we'll be sharing all the links with the audience, so we'll have access to the framework. And I hope you have a wonderful Thursday.
Thank you. Cheers, guys. Take care.
Bye. Okay, everyone. That means, with that conclusion, that brings us to the end of Product Summit 2021. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on this journey this week. And I just want to take this time to share a couple quick stats with you on what we did over these last 3 sessions since Tuesday. So since the beginning of the event, we've heard from 10 separate speakers that ranged from information from decision-making frameworks and top-level strategy, from what we heard just now, all the way to how to build product teams, and even much more philosophical and design-led stuff like how we form proper metaphors and how those metaphors shape our work, both in like product strategy, but also how we communicate our ideas and how we keep them equitable. We've had 139 people involved in the conference this year, watching from the stage and involved in the group discussions and jumping into networking. So hopefully you've made some fantastic connections. And that represents 25 countries from around the world who attended this event. That means we had 80 startups, about 60 from the Seedcamp portfolio and 20 from beyond, participating today. And this, of course, all happened over 7 hours. Now, I hope you took something away from this conference this year. I mean, that's the entire point. And for those of you who are part of the Seedcamp Nation, you're now all part of a Product Summit Telegram group, which will be morphing into the Seedcamp Product Founders, I don't know what we're going to call it yet, Product Seedcamp channel or whatever, which will sort of become the mainstay community connection moving forward. So I'll be posting content there. Other members from the mentorship team and the investment team will be talking there as well. So if you haven't joined that channel yet, there's information we posted in Mobilize, and it's also available on the stage or something. I can't remember. Probably goofed that a bit. Also, I have a sort of side announcement, not really related to Product Summit directly, but Carlos Espinal, one of the managing partners here at Seedcamp, just launched yesterday his brand new book. I'm in small screen mode, so you might be able to see that. But it's called The Fundraising Field Guide. We'll share information broader with you. But if you have raising your round, or you're working on a round right now, or even if you've done it before and you're kind of curious what the state-of-the-art fundraising technology is, please do check it out. I know Carlos and team has poured a lot of love into this book. And I read the first version way back when and took a lot from it. So please do check that out. Anyway, enough blithering on my part. All I have to say is a couple thank yous. First, thank you so much for being a part of Product Summit 2021 this year. A big shout out to my team, Miguel, Precious, and Kate, who without their support and help, we would not have created an event this smooth, this beautiful, and this educational. So hopefully you go off into your Thursday inspired and ready to build products. And I'll see you next year. Same time, same place. Goodbye.